The plan that never was. What happens when the deadline finally passes? For years, followers of the Q movement have insisted that a sweeping, hidden plan was unfolding behind the scenes, one that would expose enemies, dismantle a deep state, and fundamentally reshape the political order. Central to this belief was the idea that this plan depended on a specific window of power. That's what makes the next few years so crucial. Because if the premise is that everything hinges on a leader being in office to execute this plan, then what happens when that window closes? What happens when the time runs out? At some point, a theory that depends on real-world outcomes has to face reality. A pattern of missed predictions. One of the most striking aspects of the movement has been the sheer number of confident, specific predictions that never came true. Mass arrests, military tribunals, public revelations, the storm. None of these materialized. And yet, rather than collapsing under the weight of failed predictions, the narrative adapted. That's not an accident, it's a pattern. Another pattern that appears across these spaces is the use of highly complex or ambiguous language to explain things that are otherwise unprovable or unclear. In some New Age circles, the word vibration is often used to describe states, forces, or outcomes that cannot be measured or independently verified. It becomes a flexible explanation for almost anything, yet once you try to define it precisely or test it objectively, the concept starts to dissolve. A similar pattern appears in UFO discussions and within Q-related spaces, where terms like fourth dimension or 4D are used to explain unseen forces, entities, or even ideas like 4D chess, despite there being no observable evidence of such a dimension functioning in the way it is described. These ideas often extend far beyond what can be demonstrated or measured, and instead rely on language that sounds scientific or advanced without actually being verifiable. Another recurring example is the use of quantum language, quantum physics, quantum mechanics, quantum consciousness, quantum energy, or quantum timelines, borrowed from legitimate scientific fields but applied loosely and inconsistently. Even within actual physics, these concepts are highly technical and precisely defined. Yet in these narratives, they are often repurposed as catch-all explanations for events that otherwise lack evidence or clarity. This pattern extends beyond individual words into a broader vocabulary of abstraction that appears frequently in Q-adjacent narratives, and it is not unique to these spaces alone. Similar structures of language can be found across a wide range of ideologies, subcultures, and online communities, each developing its own set of loosely defined but highly flexible terms that serve comparable functions. Terms like awakening, red pill, the storm, white hats, black hats, the deep state, optics, and its theory are often used in ways that shift meaning depending on context. Words like optics, for example, can be used to reframe contradictory evidence as strategic appearance management rather than actual outcomes. Awakening can refer to almost any level of agreement with the narrative, regardless of evidence. Even phrases like trust the plan function less as explanations and more as placeholders that suspend the need for verification altogether. The key issue is not just the use of complex or coded terminology, but how that language functions rhetorically. Because these words are often loosely defined or emotionally charged, they can be used to support claims that would otherwise require clear evidence. They create the appearance of structure and insider knowledge, while remaining flexible enough to avoid falsification. Over time, this allows narratives to build on themselves in unstable ways. One abstract concept is used to justify another, and when contradictions appear, they are often resolved not by revising the idea, but by introducing even more layered or symbolic language. The result is a system that can appear internally consistent on the surface, but becomes increasingly difficult to test against reality. How the narrative sustains itself. Over time, 4 recurring strategies have kept the belief alive, even as reality repeatedly contradicts it. Deadlines quietly disappear. When something is supposed to happen soon or within weeks, and it doesn't, the timeline isn't abandoned, it just fades away. A new expectation replaces the old one, often without acknowledgement that anything was missed. The goalposts move. If a predicted event doesn't happen, the definition of success changes. What was once supposed to be visible and undeniable becomes symbolic, partial, or reinterpreted as something else entirely. 4D chess explanations. When outcomes don't match expectations, the fallback explanation is that everything is actually going according to plan, just at a level ordinary people can't see. The less evidence there is, the more it's framed as proof of how secret and sophisticated the strategy must be. It's still happening behind the scenes. This is the ultimate escape hatch. If nothing observable occurs, the claim becomes unfalsifiable. The plan is always ongoing, always hidden, always just out of reach of verification. Taken together, these strategies ensure that the theory can survive indefinitely, at least in principle. You could keep decoding the drops and reinterpreting posts well into the year 2100 and still be told the plan is just one step away from being revealed. What's more likely next? What's more likely than a clear ending is a continuation. Some supporters will keep analyzing and reinterpreting old material indefinitely, searching for meaning long after the original timeline has passed. Others will gradually disengage as the gap between predictions and reality becomes harder to ignore. And the narrative itself may evolve, becoming less tied to specific events and more abstract, making it harder to ever definitively disprove. In that sense, it doesn't just persist, it also functions as a distraction, keeping attention focused on decoding and speculation rather than on verifiable evidence, including the many instances where the claims have contradicted themselves or been directly disproven. The 2028 reality check. But there's a hard limit to how long a real-world claim can avoid a real-world test. If the core promise was that this transformation would occur during a specific period of political power, then the end of that period isn't just another milestone, it's a reckoning. Because at that point, one of two things has to be true. Either the plan succeeded in a clear, observable way, or it didn't. And if it didn't, then continuing to claim success requires abandoning the original premise entirely. Why this matters. This isn't just about one theory being right or wrong. It's about how people evaluate claims, evidence, and accountability. A belief system that can never be proven wrong, no matter how many predictions fail, isn't really making testable claims anymore. It's operating on faith, not evidence. That said, it is also important to be precise about what this critique is and is not. Even if one were to assume, for the sake of argument, that some of the original claims within the Q narrative were based on genuine insider knowledge or partial truths, that does not automatically resolve the broader issue. A theory still has to remain consistent with observable events, and it still has to be evaluated against outcomes over time. The central claims tied to real-world political action and the behavior of the current and former administrations are ultimately testable. And when predictions repeatedly fail, shift in meaning, or require reinterpretation to remain intact, it raises questions that cannot be answered by framing alone. In that sense, the issue is not whether every claim began as intentional misinformation, but whether the overall structure of the narrative can remain coherent when placed against publicly verifiable reality. That doesn't make people foolish for getting caught up in it. These narratives are designed to be compelling. They offer a sense of insider knowledge, a clear division between good and evil, and the promise that everything confusing will eventually make sense. But at some point, the results have to match the promises. Conclusion. If 2028 comes and goes without the events that were repeatedly predicted, it won't just be another missed deadline. It will be the expiration of the central claim. What happens after that isn't that the story disappears overnight. It's that it has to transform into something else entirely to survive. And when a theory has to constantly reinvent itself to avoid being proven wrong, it raises a simple question. Was there ever a plan at all? If you've followed this movement closely, what patterns have you noticed? At what point do repeated failed predictions stop being delays and start being evidence? Thanks for watching.